Good morning, or good afternoon, rather. Welcome to my talk. PPLdump is dead. Long live PPLdump. I'm Gabe Landau. I'm a principal at Elastic. You may know me from my work on process ghosting, anti-malware sandboxing, and my black hat talk about kernel mode threats and practical defenses, or my recent SmooCon talk on mitigating physical memory credential dumping attacks. While I used to wear red, these days I wear blue. We're going to start with background on protected processes, then cover a variety of historical and current attacks, then move on to novel research that I've done. So protected processes were introduced in Windows 8, likely to address demands of the content industry for things like Blu-ray playback. Protected processes are hardened against dumping and tampering. They'll only load specifically signed executable images, which are EXEs and DLLs. This mechanism also protects the system and registry processes on many modern Windows from tampering. So Protected Process Lite, or PPL, are an extension of the protected process mechanism designed to broaden the umbrella of things that can be protected. They have lower security but better performance. PPL have similar tamper protections as protected processes. The PPL mechanism protects core Windows internals, such as the client-server runtime subsystem, or CSRSS, the local security authority subsystem, or LSASS, the service control manager, or services.exe. The PPL mechanism also protects your antivirus, preventing malware from instantly terminating it and then running amok on your system. The rest of this talk is going to be focusing on PPL. So Windows tracks process protection within the eProcess kernel structure via two key fields, the type and the signer. Type can be either none, meaning it's not a protected process, full, or light being PPL. Signers are somewhat hierarchical and shown here on the right. Generally, higher-level signers are protected against access from lower-level signers. The most trusted level is known as WinTCB, which stands for Trusted Computing Base, followed by Windows. Below them lie LSA, anti-malware, and CodeGen as peers, which are isolated from each other. Note that this is a simplified diagram and omits details that are not relevant to this talk. Windows determines whether a process can run as PPL and at what level via the signature on its executable. Images that can run as PPL are signed with different certificates, which contain object identifiers indicating protection type and signer. On the left here, you can see the System Guard Runtime Broker executable, which can run as WinTCB full. In the middle, you can see Service Host, which can run as Windows Lite. And on the right, you can see CSRSS, which can run as WinTCB Lite. In addition to the type and signer, Windows sets a minimum signature level in the eProcess structure, restricting DLLs that the process is allowed to load. For the type column, 2 means full, 1 is light, signer 6 means WinTCB. Third from the bottom here, you can see the elastic endpoint with a signer level of 3, which stands for anti-malware. This signature level requirement prevents DLL sideloading attacks into protected processes. PPL are protected against process and thread level attacks by restricting the rights that are granted via APIs like OpenProcess and OpenThread. For example, you can't get process terminate to kill your antivirus. You can't get process vmread to dump LSASS. You can't get process dupe handle to steal handles from CSRSS. There's no exceptions for SE debug privilege. In order to keep Windows functional, Microsoft created new access rights to allow limited interaction with protected processes, such as process query limited information. Here's a quick example where we can see the system user running with the system as system integrity. They have the trusted installer group in their token, and SE debug privilege is enabled. This is a very privileged token on Windows. And yet they still cannot get access to services.exe. They cannot get a full access handle. The same request succeeds if we drop that requested access to only process query limited information. The tokens of protected processes include an attribute called a trust level. Here we can see explorer.exe has no trust level set, yet services.exe has a WinTCB Lite trust level. Trust levels are checked against trust labels. Trust labels are a system access control list component which allows trust level to be tested during any access check. For example, the known DLL's cache is protected by a WinTCB Lite trust label, preventing modification even by malicious administrators. Another example, in response to my work last year demonstrating how anti-malware processes can be forcefully sandboxed by malicious administrators, Microsoft added trust labels to the tokens of protected processes. Now let's talk about some historical attacks. There's a lot to cover here and not a lot of time, so I'm going to be moving quickly. Most of this is prior art from a talk by Alex Ionescu and James Forshaw titled Unknown Known DLLs and Other Code Integrity Trust Violations. You'll see citations at the bottom of every slide. So the process of checking a digital signature is both CPU and I/O intensive. When code integrity checks the signature of a file and finds those signing level OIDs we talked about before, it saves this information in an on-disk cache to avoid having to do it again in the future. Well, there was a race condition in this process where it was possible to modify the file after it's verified, but before the cache entry was written. This allowed an attacker to have arbitrary files with trusted cache signing levels. For performance reasons, when Windows starts, it preloads several commonly used DLLs, creating a cache called known DLLs. This cache resides at a known location at the root of the object manager namespace and is considered pre-verified and trusted by PPL. PPL will load DLLs from it without further verification. When Windows added support for containers or silos, similar to Docker, it included the ability to create kind of a root jail, which assigns a new root object manager namespace for that process. This means that all named objects, including drives, network shares, events, mutexes, named pipes, etc., are in a new namespace away from the rest of the OS. While an attacker can't modify the existing known DLLs directory due to the aforementioned trust label, they can use this root capability to create a new namespace with a top-level counterfeit known DLLs containing any DLL of their choosing. This PPL inside such a root jail will load and honor this known DLLs directory. Microsoft removed known DLL support for PPL in July of last year, fixing this vulnerability. Some script interpreter DLLs will automatically load a user configurable script. Using a tool called .NET to JS, an attacker can convert a .NET payload into JScript and then set some registry keys to hijack any COM object that was already being used by a PPL. When that PPL runs and tries to use the COM object, it will instead load the attacker's specified script interpreter DLL, and hence the attacker's JScript, granting the attacker arbitrary .NET code execution within the PPL. This was fixed in 1803 by disallowing script interpreters within PPL. The Windows Error Reporting Process Memory Dumper, or WRFault Secure, creates encrypted memory dumps to protect the confidentiality of memory within protected processes and PPL. For example, you don't want somebody to be able to use WRFault Secure to dump LSASS. In 2014, Alex Ionescu found a bug in Windows 8.1 builds of WRFault Secure that can lead to the creation of unencrypted dumps. Microsoft fixed this issue in 2014, but an old pre-patch vulnerable builds can still run as WinTCB full on modern Windows 11. Their signatures are still honored and valid. These executables can be used to dump any protected process, and this serves as a partial LSASS run as PPL defeat. James Forshaw demonstrated that an undocumented COM interface can be used to call any function within a COM process's address space. WRFault Secure is vulnerable to such an attack. Normally, this is benign for privilege escalation because you need a 128-bit secret that only resides within that process's address space. However, you can use one instance of WRFault Secure to dump the memory of another instance of WRFault Secure, learning its secret and then achieving arbitrary code execution within that second instance. So in order to run as anti-malware light, vendors must sign, antivirus vendors or anti-malware vendors must sign binding legal documents and create an early launch anti-malware driver, which Microsoft will then sign. This driver contains a list of certificate hashes intended to allow that AV vendor to sign new builds without going through Microsoft every time. Once this ELAM driver is loaded by code integrity, any executables signed by the certificates in that list are allowed to run as anti-malware light. Matt Graber discovered that several AV vendors created ELAM drivers which include intermediate CAs for very large CAs, including Microsoft, Comodo, and Symantec, allowing millions of files to run as anti-malware light that shouldn't be running as anti-malware light. Graber released a tool called anti-malware blight that leverages an overly permissive ELAM driver to allow you to run arbitrary PowerShell commands as anti-malware light. Even though it's one of the lower levels of PPL, such processes are still unkillable by traditional administrative tools, and they may be able to tamper with the system's security software. Microsoft can't just revoke these certificates for fear of breaking existing machines. It's kind of a mess. So this one's probably the best known bug. The define DOS device API defines, redefines, or deletes an MS-DOS device name. DOS drive letters such as C:, are just symbolic links in the object manager namespace. Define DOS device is exported by kernel 32, but really it's an RPC call over to CSRSS, which does the real symlink work. A time of check, time of use vulnerability in its implementation allows an attacker to inject entries into the known DLL's cache and all of the aforementioned fun that entails. James Forshaw publicly described this in 2018 in a blog post. However, Microsoft didn't act on it until Clément Labro released a turnkey implementation in 2021, which he called PPLdump. Microsoft removed known DLL support in July of last year, fixing this vulnerability. So the final attack involves the use of custom type libraries, or TLB files, that are intentionally crafted to trigger type confusion within a COM server. This leads to memory corruption and can enable an attacker to install a known DLL's handle value of their choosing within a protected process, or PPL. While originally documented by James Forshaw and Alex Ionescu in 2018, a variant of this was released in March of this year by the author of PPLdump, Clément Labro, as a turnkey tool that he calls PPL Medic. Microsoft said that they are working on a mitigation for this, for known DLL handle tampering, and it's going to be shipping in June or July of this year. So now I want to talk you through how I found a novel path to code execution within PPL. So one day, while using Process Monitor, I observed services.exe paging in DLLs from disk. And it got me thinking, if I can control the device hosting a DLL, can I perform a bait and switch attack and inject my executable code into a protected process? Such an attack is called a time of check, time of use, or a TOC2. At a high level, the attack is going to go like this. We're going to set up a PPL process to load a DLL from a storage device that we control. Code integrity, which runs in the kernel, will verify the signature on the DLL, and then the kernel will map it into the process. This is normal. At some point later, the PPL will execute a portion of that DLL. We're going to force a page fault, which will trigger a second read of that file's contents from our storage device, which will then return a payload instead of the original file. That's the plan. Let's try to make it happen. So when you digitally sign a file, you can choose to add page hashes, which are hashes of each individual 4 kilobyte page within the file. These granular hashes allow the memory manager to verify each page's integrity as it's paged in from disk. Compare this to regular Authenticode signatures, which requires processing the entire file as a monolithic entity. Page hashes are protected by a file's digital signature, so they are resistant to tampering at rest. Here we can see sign tool output showing page hashes for services.exe. Note that event aggregation.dll does not have any page hashes, and this makes it a candidate for our attack. To start, let's run a protected process. I picked services.exe because it can run as WinTCB Lite, which is the highest level of PPL. Here we can see a file being opened, mapped, and loaded, but not read or paged from. That's not good enough. We need to go deeper. Maybe adding some complexity to the I/O stack will give us more capabilities for hackery. So let's replace event aggregation with a symbolic link to the loopback SMB interface. SMB stands for server message block. It's another name for Windows file sharing. What we see here in //127.001/C$ is Windows' default share of the C drive. Rerunning services.exe, we can see a paging read, which I highlighted here in blue, followed immediately by a regular read. When I dug into the stacks for these two operations, I saw the paging read was I/O issued by the memory manager to the network redirector, SMB, which then issued a regular read to the local file system. They're basically two parts of the same operation. So it's a start, but it's not enough. We need more paging reads. We just watched services.exe read event aggregation, but in order to do a time of check, time of use, we need it to occur as multiple reads. Perhaps we can slow this process down using an opportunistic lock or op lock. An op lock is a feature built into NTFS and SMB that enables non-cooperative locking of files. When a file is locked using an op lock, any other attempts to open that file will be suspended until the op lock is released. To look for op block targets, let's zoom in on file open operations or create file operations. Another word for it is create file operations that you'll see in that list. How about devobj.dll here, which we can see here loaded in blue on one thread, while event aggregation at the same time is being loaded in red on a different thread. So setting an op block on devobj.dll, we can see the IO operation has no result. It's still pending. Switching over to our kernel debugger, we can see the thread attempting to load devobj.dll is hung on NTFS wait for op block completion event. Once we release the op block, the operation completes. We just successfully suspended a PPL mid-startup. So where do we go from here? We've frozen a PPL. We're aiming to do a time of check, time of use with paging, but all the pages are resident. So to push those pages out of memory, I considered the empty working set API. However, it's out of the question because it requires the process set quota access right, which is a write privilege, and you cannot get that right to a PPL. As an administrator, however, we have the SC profile single process privilege, which allows us to empty the working set and standby list for the entire system. By emptying the system's working set after services.exe breaks our op block, we can see a lot of paging I/O. Here, I left the op block hung for about 30 seconds. So there's a clear delineation above and below that red line. If you look in the left column, you can see the time jumps from 17 seconds to 51 seconds. That's when I chose to release the op block. And all the paging I/O occurs after the op block is released. So now that we can reliably force page faults for a DLL inside of a PPL, let's try to inject some code. We're going to disable the local SMB server, which is hosted by the landman server service, and then restart the machine to free up that port. Because the port does not get released immediately when you stop the server. It's just an implementation detail of Windows. So we have to restart the machine, and then we're going to launch our own Python SMB server based on Impacket. It's going to serve up the original DLL for the first time it's queried for code integrity, to appease code integrity. And then it's going to add some special sauce on subsequent times that DLL is served. The payload starts with a CC, and then it has some hex 90 nops, and then it has cafe code, which is just something unique to it that we can identify. So running this, we get a break into our kernel debugger. The instruction pointer is add a CC software breakpoint, followed by hex 90 nops and hex cafe code, which matches our payload. We can see the current process is services.exe, the protection type is 1, and the signer is 6. We just successfully achieved code execution as WinTCB Lite. So great, we got code execution, but can we get rid of that noisy reboot? Landman server takes the port and doesn't give it back without a reboot, so I don't want to use SMB. WebDAV, which is another type of network redirector on Windows, based on HTTP sort of, it allows you to use any port you want, but it doesn't exhibit the paging behavior that we want, so that one's out. I Googled around and stumbled across an excellent article by James Forshaw titled Trapping Virtual Memory Access, which describes his work on problems similar to what I'm facing. To summarize, he describes how to use the Windows Cloud Filter API combined with the loopback SMB adapter to trap file access in a granular manner. The Cloud Filter API allows OneDrive and similar apps to create stub files on your machine that represent much larger files in the cloud. When the file is accessed, a callback gets invoked, a rehydration callback gets invoked, and then an application can maybe reach out to the cloud to download the file's contents or something along those lines. And this is called a rehydration callback. So as a bonus, Forshaw provided working sample code. So integrating the Cloud Filter API into the attack, the final exploit looks like this. Number 1, use Cloud Filter to create an empty placeholder file with a callback function that we control. Next, we're going to symlink event aggregation to the placeholder file through the loopback SMB interface. Next, we're going to set the op block as I described before. Next, we are going to run services.exe, which then attempts to load event aggregation. Event aggregation is a symlink, goes over the loopback SMB adapter to the placeholder file, which ends up leading to our rehydration getting invoked, our Cloud Filter rehydration callback. At this point, we serve the original event aggregation.dll for code integrity verification. We page everything out by emptying the working set and standby lists. Next, we release the op lock to allow services to continue executing. The services resumes, and this leads to paging reads over SMB, which are forwarded to the placeholder just like before. However, this time, when our callback fires, we serve a specially sauced version of event aggregation. We add our pick payload into the version of DLL that's being served. Pick is position independent code. It's like shellcode. And that shellcode runs inside services.exe as WinTCB Lite. This particular payload dumps the process of your choosing. And this is PPL fault. All right, so what we have here is Windows 11 Insider. I recorded this demo at the end of March, but it still works. And what I want to point out is, sorry, demo didn't work properly. OK, so we have Windows 11 Insider here. And it was fully up to date as of when I recorded this. I also tested this last week, and the same exploit still works. We have LSASS here running as a PPL LSA. And you can see the same information here on the console, on the shell, that was running as LSA. We run PPLdump on that process. We can see access is denied. So PPL is doing its thing. Next, we run PPL fault. I pass -v for verbose output. And I want to point out two things in this output. The first one is that the rehydration callback is invoked, and it serves the original file. And then the rehydration callback is invoked again, and we add the payload to it. To make sure that the dump is actually intact, we're going to open it up in WinDebug and take a look. So opening up the dump, we're going to check the PEB and make sure it's just a sanity check it. We didn't make sure we didn't create an empty file or something. So here we can see LSASS in the PEB, the module list. So when PPLdump was patched, Austin Hudson released an exploit chain that he had written and had been privately using called Angry Orchard, because the PPLdump patch had broken it. Angry Orchard exploits a bug in anti-user hard error control, which is a system call that allows CSRSS to perform an arbitrary decrement in kernel memory. Angry Orchard uses this to decrement kthread.previousMode from 1 to 0. Meaning it decrements the thread's mode from user mode to kernel mode. Sometimes referred to as a God mode exploit, this previous mode manipulation makes the kernel treat your thread as a kernel system worker thread. This can lead to some weird results. Pointers are not checked. Access checks are skipped. And you can do crazy things like write process memory to kernel addresses, or open things that are normally completely inaccessible to user mode, such as the physical memory device or the system process. By chaining PPL fault with the anti-user hard error control exploit, we can get full access handle to the physical memory device, giving us the ability to modify physical memory arbitrarily. I call this exploit chain God fault. All right, so what we have here is a Windows 11 VM, and I have Godfault inside of it. I've modified this build of Godfault slightly to add a debug breakpoint. This VM is actually running under a kernel debugger, so I can show you some things from kernel mode that are not visible from user mode. So I'm going to run the exploit, and it's going to break into the kernel debugger in just a second. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the previous mode of the current thread. We can see here the thread is running the Godfault exploit, which is actually user mode code. So the previous mode on this thread should be 1, which stands for user mode. But in fact, it's 0, which stands for kernel mode. So the first thing that this thread does after the exploit is successful is it opens the physical memory device for sectional access, which means read and write. And it saves that handle in a local variable called hsection. The handle value here is 1BC, so we're going to run bang handle on that. And we can see here that it is, in fact, the physical memory device. So we were able to open the physical memory device from user mode. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to open the system process for process all access. And the value is saved in this local variable hSystem process with a handle value of 1D0. So bang handle 1D0, and then I have to do one more step to actually see the process's name. So I'm going to do bang process here. And we can see it's, in fact, the system process. And the granted access is 1FFFFF, which is process all access. So the root of the problem here is a time of check, time of use, where signature validation is decoupled from paging. If only Windows had some way to validate the hashes of pages. So I work on the Elastic Endpoint, which is an antivirus and EDR. So I'm interested in mitigations. How do we stop this? Well, AV vendors can't modify the memory manager's behavior to require page hashes, but we can target other points in PPL fault exploit chain. Windows includes an exploit mitigation that can prevent a process from loading DLLs over the network. Originally intended to make payload delivery for things like browser and Office exploitation, this feature is also useful here because PPL fault uses SMB to achieve the desired paging behavior. A naive approach would be to use the set process mitigation PowerShell commandlet. However, that just sets a registry key, and if your attacker is an admin, they can just change the registry key. Instead, I wrote a driver, which I'm calling nofault, that forcibly enables the no remote images mitigation early in the life cycle of all PPL. And here's nofault in action. So I'm going to be running the PPL fault exploit against the, real quick, and then I'm going to start the nofault driver, and then I'm going to rerun the exploit, and it's going to fail. And just to prove, I'm going to stop the nofault driver now, and then I'm going to rerun the same exact command, and it succeeds. And that's it. So as far as timelines go, I reported PPL fault and God fault along with their source code to MSRC in September. I also informed them of the Angry Orchard exploit. About a month later, after a few ignored follow-up emails, I pinged them on Twitter, and they closed the case, stating that there would be no further action. When I announced this talk on Twitter in February, the Defender team reached out to me a few hours later asking to learn more. So I directed them to my then 5-month-old MSRC report. I don't know how MSRC works internally, but their triage process left the Defender team in the dark about vulnerabilities pertinent to Defender. This is actually the second such experience I've had with MSRC. Given this sequence of events, maybe the MSRC process, triage process should be revisited. In conclusion, it's really hard to defend against an admin who can modify the operating system. Admins have a lot of power and attack surface. Next, remember that UAC is really just a gentleman's agreement, as is PPL, and the admin kernel boundary. These defense in-depth measures are often just security through obscurity. If you know the right sequence of actions or API calls, you can walk right past. Open sesame. Driver signing and HVCI make it seem as though Microsoft has an interest in protecting the kernel from admins. But when I recently demonstrated a violation of this, MSRC just shrugged. Next, if MSRC doesn't take you seriously, try reaching out via other channels such as MVI Collaborate if you're an MVI member, or contact a member of the Defender team on Twitter. If all that fails and you really want your bug fixed, Microsoft has de facto proven that you must escalate it to the point of active abuse. So write an exploit, make it very easy to use, and put it on GitHub. I want to take a quick moment to give a shout out to Apple for defending their kernels against malicious admins. I often see iOS patch notes like this, and I hope that someday Microsoft follows suit. Maybe starting with Angry Orchard. Once again, I'm Gabe Landau. I work at Elastic Security. Any opinions here expressed are my own. You'll be able to find the code for all the tools I disclosed here on my GitHub later today. I'm out of time, but I'll happily take any questions you may have out in the hall, or you can hit me up on Twitter. Thank you.